Snow fell the way it used to when people still trusted winter to arrive on time, not in wild gusts or blinding sheets, but steady and patient, as if the sky itself had decided to slow down. Each flake drifted carefully onto Brookdale's Main Street, settling on rooftops, flagpoles, and the shoulders of people who had come out early despite the cold. The kind of snow that softened sound and memory alike. For the older folks gathered along the curb, it felt familiar, comforting even. Many of them had lived long enough to remember winters when streets were quieter, when parades meant something more than noise and spectacle. Veterans Day always did. Metal folding chairs lined the sidewalk, their legs sinking slightly into the slush. Some people stood instead, leaning on canes or walkers, unwilling to sit while the colors passed. Small American flags fluttered in gloved hands. Thermoses were shared. Stories were exchanged in low voices, names of old units, old places, old friends who never made it home. Officer Thomas Hale stood at the front edge of the staging area, facing down Main Street. At 58, he no longer pretended the cold didn't bother him. It crept into his knees and settled deep in his lower back. Still, he stood straight, shoulders squared, uniform crisp beneath his winter coat. Beside him sat Rex. The German shepherd was perfectly still, as if carved there. Snow collected lightly along his back and ears, unmoving. His dark eyes watched the street ahead with calm focus, ears angled just enough to catch everything. The harness across his chest bore the K9 unit patch, worn but well cared for. Thomas rested a gloved hand on Rex's shoulder. The warmth beneath the thick fur grounded him. 5 years. That was how long they'd worked together. Long enough that Thomas no longer thought in commands when Rex was near. Long enough that silence between them felt natural. Rex had come into Thomas's life after Margaret died. The house had been too quiet then, too still. Nights stretched on forever, and mornings arrived without purpose. The department suggested a K9 assignment, said it might help. Thomas hadn't believed them. He'd been wrong. The parade marshal raised his arm. A whistle cut through the air. Somewhere down the street, a drum began to beat, slow, deliberate, echoing off brick buildings softened by snow. The parade was starting. The color guard moved first, boots crunching in unison. Behind them came veterans from different eras, some walking proudly, others riding slowly on a flatbed decorated with wreaths and flags. Faces in the crowd softened as they watched. A few people saluted. Others simply stood very still. Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He always did at moments like this. Rex remained seated, posture flawless. "Good boy," Thomas murmured. As the parade moved forward, the crowd leaned in. A little too close, maybe, but no one complained. The snow made everyone feel closer, quieter, like the world had drawn a curtain around them. That was when Thomas felt it. A shift. It wasn't dramatic. Rex didn't bark. He didn't move suddenly. His breathing changed first, just slightly. Then his ears angled forward, sharper than before. Thomas glanced down. Rex's nose lifted. His chest expanded as he drew in the cold air once, twice, longer the second time. "Rex," Thomas whispered. The dog's gaze had locked onto something off to the right, toward the densest part of the crowd, where most of the older spectators stood. Thomas tightened his grip on the leash. "Easy," he said quietly. Rex's muscles tensed beneath Thomas's hand. Not fear, not excitement. Focus. Thomas's heart rate picked up. Rex didn't do this. He was trained to ignore crowds, sudden movements, unexpected sounds. He'd sat calmly through fireworks, protests, even a school gym full of screaming children. "Rex," Thomas said again, firmer now. "Heel!" The command didn't land. Rex shifted his weight forward. A ripple of unease passed through Thomas. He scanned the crowd quickly. No obvious disturbance. No shouting, no sudden movement. Just people bundled in coats, faces turned toward the parade. The marching band began to play, brass instruments cutting through the quiet. The sound echoed sharply off the snow-dampened street. Rex stood. Several heads turned. Someone laughed nervously. "Dog's excited," a man said. Thomas felt the leash pull, not hard, but with intention. "Rex," he warned. For one brief moment, training and instinct collided. Then Rex surged forward. The leash snapped tight. Thomas stumbled, boots sliding on the icy pavement. He dug in, gripping harder. and felt the clasp give way. Rex broke free. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Chairs scraped backward. A woman cried out as Rex sprinted toward the sidewalk, his paws throwing up snow as he ran straight through the narrowing gap between street and spectators. "Dog loose!" someone shouted. The band faltered. Music collapsed into noise. Thomas ran. "Rex!" he yelled, adrenaline surging. But Rex didn't slow. He cut toward an elderly man standing near a lamppost, slightly apart from the others. The man wore a heavy wool coat and a faded veteran's cap pulled low over thinning white hair. One hand gripped a metal cane, the other pressed awkwardly against his chest. Rex reached him just as the man swayed, and then the man began to fall. Rex moved before the man hit the ground. The German shepherd twisted his body sideways, pressing hard against the man's legs and hip, taking part of the weight as gravity won the rest. The cane slipped from the man's hand and clattered uselessly against the pavement. Snow puffed up as both of them went down together. Not gracefully, but not violently either. The man's knees struck first. His shoulder followed. Rex went down with him, positioning his body between the man and the frozen ground, as if he had practiced it 100 times. For half a second, the world froze. Then chaos rushed back in. "Oh my God," someone screamed. "Call 911!" Thomas dropped to his knees beside them, snow soaking instantly through his uniform pants. His hands moved on instinct now, years of training overriding the shock still buzzing in his head. "Sir, can you hear me?" Thomas asked, leaning close. The man's eyes were open but unfocused. His lips parted slightly. No sound came out. Rex barked once, sharp, urgent, not aggressive, not frightened. A call for help. Thomas checked the man's pulse. It was there but weak and uneven. "Ambulance en route," another officer shouted from behind him, already on the radio. The crowd had fallen back into a loose circle, faces pale, breath caught. Snow continued to fall, indifferent, settling into footprints in the grooves of the street. Rex pressed his body closer to the man's side, warmth radiating through his thick coat. He licked the man's gloved hand, whining softly now, insistently, as if urging him to stay. "Easy, boy," Thomas murmured, though his own hands trembled. The man's chest rose shallowly. His breathing sounded wrong, labored, uneven. Thomas glanced up, scanning the faces around him. "Has anyone seen this man before? Family? Anyone?" A woman near the front pressed a hand to her mouth. "That's Harold Bennett," she said. "He comes every year." Another voice chimed in. "He's a veteran. Navy, I think." Harold's eyes fluttered. For a brief moment they focused, just enough. "Cold," he whispered, barely audible. "I know," Thomas said gently. "Help's coming. Stay with me, Harold." Rex's ears flicked at the sound of the man's voice. He barked again, softer this time, tail thumping once against the snow. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. The parade marshal stood frozen near the curb, his clipboard forgotten, his face drained of color. The band members lowered their instruments, unsure what to do. Flags drooped slightly in gloved hands. This wasn't part of the program. This wasn't rehearsed. An EMT truck skidded to a stop nearby, followed closely by an ambulance. Paramedics jumped out, boots crunching in the snow, gear already in hand. Male, mid-70s, Thomas briefed quickly, collapsed. Weak pulse, labored breathing. They worked fast, oxygen mask, blood pressure cuff. Calm voices cutting through the cold. Rex stayed where he was, pressed against Harold's side, refusing to move even as strangers crowded close. "It's okay, boy," Thomas said, resting a hand on Rex's back. "They've got him." Reluctantly, Rex shifted just enough to allow the paramedics room. He sat immediately afterward, eyes locked on Harold, body tense but controlled. Harold was lifted onto the stretcher. As they raised him, his hand slipped free from the blanket and dangled limply. Rex stood and nudged it gently with his nose. Harold's fingers curled weakly around a tuft of fur. "I got you," Harold whispered, voice thin but present. Rex stilled, allowing it. The ambulance doors closed with a heavy thud. Sirens rose again, then faded as the vehicle pulled away. For several seconds, no one spoke. Snow drifted down, filling the silence. Thomas clipped a spare leash onto Rex's harness, his fingers clumsy with cold and adrenaline. Only then did he realize his heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. "You okay?" another officer asked quietly. Thomas nodded. Yeah, he wasn't sure that was true. The parade was officially suspended. People lingered, reluctant to leave, speaking in hushed tones. Some wiped their eyes. Others stared at Rex with something like awe. "He knew," an older man said softly. "That dog knew." Rex sat beside Thomas, posture calm again, as if nothing unusual had happened. Snow dusted his back and muzzle. His breathing slowed. Thomas looked down at him, disbelief still twisting in his chest. "You broke formation," he thought again, "and saved a life." Later that afternoon, long after the street had been cleared and the last folding chair stacked away, Thomas found himself in the quiet of the station's K9 unit. Rex lay at his feet, exhausted now, paws twitching faintly as he slept. The heater hummed. Outside, snow continued to fall, thickening the world beyond the windows. Thomas replayed the moment over and over, the tension in the leash, the certainty in Rex's movement, the way instinct had overridden every command he'd ever taught. He had been trained to maintain control, to follow protocol, to keep order. Rex had been trained too. But some things, Thomas realized, went deeper than training. The phone rang. Thomas answered it on the second ring. "Officer Hale," a woman's voice said. "This is St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about Harold Bennett." Thomas's breath caught. "He's stable," she continued. "Doctors say if help had come even a minute later, it might have been very different." Thomas closed his eyes. "There was a dog involved?" the woman asked. Thomas looked down at Rex, who had woken and was now watching him. Ears relaxed, eyes steady. "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "There was." News spread quickly in Brookdale. By the next morning, the local paper's headline read, "Canine dog breaks parade formation, saves elderly." Veteran's life. Thomas never liked being the center of attention, and Rex certainly didn't care for it. But both were now subjects of whispered awe across town. The officers at the station teased Thomas gently, though no one could deny the pride in their eyes. Even with the attention, Thomas felt uneasy. He knew training manuals and parade. Rules didn't include allow the dog to decide who might die. Every officer in the department would be talking about him and Rex, dissecting the incident. The thought made his chest tighten. Yet underneath it all was a quiet satisfaction. Harold Bennett was alive, breathing steadily in a hospital bed, because his partner, his dog, had acted. That evening, Thomas finally visited Harold at St. Mary's. Snow still fell lightly outside, frosting the hospital windows. The winter's quiet was a sharp contrast to the chaos of the parade. Inside, the room smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh linens, punctuated with the sweet scent of flowers someone had brought. Harold sat in a recliner, covered in a thick blanket, a faint pink flush coloring his cheeks. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, but the tremors had faded. "Harold," Thomas said softly, stepping into the room, Rex trailing beside him. Harold's eyes lit up, though his expression was still fragile. "Thomas and Rex," he paused, voice hoarse. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," Thomas replied. "You're okay now. That's what matters." Rex sat patiently at Harold's side, nose twitching as he sniffed the blanket and the room. He lifted his head, meeting Harold's gaze, then gently nudged the veteran's hand with his nose. "You've got a good boy there," Harold said, voice trembling with emotion. "Smartest dog I've ever seen. Saved me. Saved me from something I might not have survived." Thomas swallowed. "He didn't think about saving you. He just knew." Harold reached out and patted Rex on the head. "He knew," he said, echoing Thomas's words. "And I'll never forget it." Thomas studied the veteran's face. Years of service, years of loyalty, and decades of life experiences had left their mark. Thin lines around the eyes, careful posture, quiet dignity. Harold wasn't the type to exaggerate, to dramatize. If he said he was saved, Thomas knew it was true. Later, after Thomas and Rex left the hospital, they walked through streets glazed with fresh snow. The town had quieted. A few early morning pedestrians passed, careful not to disturb the pristine sidewalks. Snowflakes clung to Rex's coat, to Thomas's hat, settling lightly on shoulders and boots. Thomas reflected on the parade, the crowd, the unexpected collapse, the chaos. Every step replayed in his mind, the way Rex had anticipated the danger, the way instinct had overtaken training. And then the thought settled firmly. Sometimes protocol couldn't account for every life, every second. Sometimes survival depended on trusting a partner, even when rules insisted otherwise. That week, letters began arriving at the K9 unit station. Handwritten notes carefully folded, each one thanking Rex and Thomas for their courage. One came from a retired colonel, recalling a time when K9s had been used in rescue operations overseas. Another from a local schoolteacher, recounting the story to her students and praising the lesson of vigilance, loyalty, and compassion. Harold's family visited the station later that week. His daughter, Marjorie, arrived carrying a small box of handmade cookies. Tears welled in her eyes as she knelt beside Rex, hugging him without hesitation. "You didn't even think twice," she whispered. "You just ran to him. You saved my father." Rex accepted the affection with quiet dignity. Tail thumping once against the floor, Thomas watched, heart swelling, knowing that no medal or headline could match the weight of gratitude in the room. The following day, the department held a small ceremony. Snow flurries drifted down, soft against the black and white uniforms and polished boots. No marching band, no cheering crowd, just officers, city officials, Harold himself, and Rex, standing stoically as a simple medal was affixed to his harness. Thomas was asked to speak. His throat tightened as he faced the small assembly. "I was trained to control my dog," he said, voice steady despite the emotion rising inside him. "To maintain formation, to follow orders. But sometimes training isn't enough. Sometimes instinct matters more than procedure." He knelt beside Rex, running a hand down the dog's back. This dog didn't see a parade. He didn't see a crowd. He saw someone in danger, and he acted. That's loyalty. That's courage. Harold adjusted his veteran's cap, smiling faintly. "Sometimes the simplest things are the most heroic," he said. "And sometimes the simplest things save lives." As the ceremony concluded, snow continued to fall lightly, dusting rooftops, flags, and boots alike. Thomas and Rex walked slowly back toward the station, leaving footprints behind them that would soon be hidden by fresh snow, but never forgotten by those who witnessed what had happened. That evening, Thomas sat at his kitchen table. Sipping coffee, Rex curled at his feet. The quiet hum of the heater mixed with the occasional drift of snow against the windows. For a long time, Thomas simply watched the dog sleep, remembering the chaos and the calm, the fear and the certainty, the collapse and the rescue. He understood now, more clearly than ever. Courage wasn't about following orders perfectly. Loyalty wasn't about obedience alone. And sometimes, the bravest act came from trusting someone else, even when it defied everything you had been taught. Rex stirred, lifting his head to glance at Thomas. The dog's eyes met his with that calm, unshakable certainty. No words were needed. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. That week, letters began arriving at the K9 unit station. Handwritten notes carefully folded, each one thanking Rex and Thomas for their courage. One came from a retired colonel, recalling a time when K9s had been used in rescue operations overseas. Another from a local schoolteacher, recounting the story to her students and praising the lesson of vigilance, loyalty, and compassion. Harold's family visited the station later that week. His daughter, Marjorie, arrived carrying a small box of handmade cookies. Tears welled in her eyes as she knelt beside Rex, hugging him without hesitation. "You didn't even think twice," she whispered. "You just ran to him. You saved my father." Rex accepted the affection with quiet dignity. Tail thumping once against the floor, Thomas watched, heart swelling, knowing that no medal or headline could match the weight of gratitude in the room. The following day, the department held a small ceremony. Snow flurries drifted down, soft against the black and white uniforms and polished boots. No marching band, no cheering crowd, just officers, city officials, Harold himself, and Rex, standing stoically as a simple medal was affixed to his harness. Thomas was asked to speak. His throat tightened as he faced the small assembly. "I was trained to control my dog," he said, voice steady despite the emotion rising inside him. "To maintain formation, to follow orders. But sometimes training isn't enough. Sometimes instinct matters more than procedure. He knelt beside Rex, running a hand down the dog's back. This dog didn't see a parade. He didn't see a crowd. He saw someone in danger, and he acted. That's loyalty. That's courage. Harold adjusted his veteran's cap, smiling faintly. Sometimes the simplest things are the most heroic, he said. And sometimes the simplest things save lives. As the ceremony concluded, snow continued to fall lightly, dusting rooftops, flags, and boots alike. Thomas and Rex walked slowly back toward the station, leaving footprints behind them that would soon be hidden by fresh snow, but never forgotten by those who witnessed what had happened. That evening, Thomas sat at his kitchen table. Sipping coffee, Rex curled at his feet. The quiet hum of the heater mixed with the occasional drift of snow against the windows. For a long time, Thomas simply watched the dog sleep, remembering the chaos and the calm, the fear and the certainty, the collapse and the rescue. He understood now, more clearly than ever. Courage wasn't about following orders perfectly. Loyalty wasn't about obedience alone. And sometimes, the bravest act came from trusting someone else, even when it defied everything you had been taught. Rex stirred, lifting his head to glance at Thomas. The dog's eyes met his with that calm, unshakable certainty. No words were needed. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. Outside, snow fell steadily, soft and relentless, covering the town in white. And in that quiet, Thomas realized that in Brookdale, no story of courage, loyalty, or instinct would ever fade, not while Rex was there to remind everyone what it truly meant to save a life. In the quiet of the following days, Brookdale seemed to hold its breath. Snow continued to fall intermittently, layering rooftops and lawns in sparkling white, muffling the usual hum of the small town. The streets were nearly empty during business hours, only the crunch of boots on icy pavement or the occasional hum of a delivery truck. Breaking the stillness, Thomas found himself thinking about that morning constantly, replaying every detail in the haze of falling snow. The way Rex had sensed danger, the moment Harold's knees buckled, the soft whine of reassurance from the dog as paramedics worked. Harold Bennett, for his part, had begun to tell pieces of his story to those who asked. At 74, he had the careful, measured cadence of someone who had lived a life full of discipline, service and sacrifice. Navy service during the 1960s had taken him across the world. South Pacific, Mediterranean waters, cold Atlantic nights. He spoke of young men lost, of friendships forged and broken by distance and circumstance. He spoke of winters far harsher than this one, when the biting wind seemed to erase hope entirely. Yet none of that prepared him for the fragility of standing too long on a snowy curb in Brookdale, surrounded by friends and strangers alike. He recalled that moment as if seeing it in a slow-motion photograph. One second he was standing, hands gripping his cane and heart beating steadily. The next, a sharp, sudden weakness pulled him down. Then impossibly there was Rex, not a man, not a stranger, a dog. And yet everything that mattered in that instant was concentrated in the animal's body. The warmth, the positioning, the unspoken insistence that he held on. Harold didn't remember the fall fully, only the feeling of being caught, supported, and guided. And somehow, miraculously, it had been enough. Thomas visited him regularly after the incident, often accompanied by Rex. Snow or no snow, Thomas made the journey each time because he understood, intellectually and emotionally, that a bond had formed between man and dog that no medal could encapsulate. At the hospital, or during short walks down the hospital corridor when doctors permitted, Harold would reach for Rex, his hand trembling slightly, and the dog would respond with quiet patience. Sometimes Harold would whisper fragments of the old Navy songs he once sang on deck, and Rex would cock his head, listening, as though the music carried meaning only he could understand. Meanwhile, the community's response continued to grow. Local newspapers printed letters to the editor recounting the story, often emphasizing not the drama of the parade, but the quiet heroism that had unfolded in an instant. Children in schools were assigned to write about bravery, loyalty, and instincts, and many chose Rex as their example. Teachers told Thomas and Harold's families that the story had sparked a kind of reflection among students, inspiring them to think about what courage meant in everyday life. Social media buzzed quietly, small-town pride amplifying into a quiet wave of admiration. At the K9 unit, Thomas faced both commendation and scrutiny. Some officers questioned his decision to let Rex break formation, even after the fact. Others quietly congratulated him, knowing that rules were meant to guide, but could not replace instinct. Thomas had trained his whole career to control situations, to maintain order, to anticipate threats. Yet he had never learned in manuals that trust sometimes had to extend beyond human instruction, and that courage could reside in the instincts of a companion, an animal, loyal beyond measure, whose judgment might surpass human protocol. One snowy evening, Thomas found himself sitting on a bench outside the station, watching snowflakes drift lazily across the street lamps. Rex lay beside him, ears flicking occasionally as a lone car passed slowly. The quiet was different now, heavier, more reflective. Thomas thought about the parade, the collapse, the thousands of people who had witnessed something extraordinary and yet subtle. He thought about the fragile line between life and death, how quickly it could shift. And he thought about trust, the kind of trust that allowed a dog to make a split-second decision that saved a life. Back at Harold's house, his family prepared for his discharge. Snow had coated the sidewalks in a layer, thick enough to leave the world soft and glowing, though treacherous for those with unsteady legs. Thomas insisted on accompanying Rex, knowing that the dog's presence alone was a stabilizing force. When Harold opened the door, he paused for a long moment, taking in the snow, the quiet streets, and the familiar brown and black form at his side. He smiled faintly, fragile but genuine. "You saved me," Harold said simply. Rex barked softly, as if to agree, tail thumping once against the floor. "No," Thomas said quietly. "You saved yourself." Rex just knew where to be. They walked carefully inside, the warmth of the house embracing them. The fireplace was lit, the smell of pine from nearby decorations mingling with the faint scent of hot cocoa. The family gathered around, hesitant yet full of gratitude, their eyes lingering on Rex in wonder. Harold reached down, touching the dog's head gently. "You knew, didn't you?" Harold asked, voice low. Rex tilted his head, a single bark escaping. Thomas smiled. Yes, he had known. Word of the incident continued to ripple through Brookdale over the next few weeks. The story of Rex and Harold became more than a parade anecdote. It became a quiet legend about instinct, loyalty, and the bonds between humans and animals. The local library displayed a photo of Rex, harnessed and alert, snow falling softly around him, next to a framed newspaper clipping. People came to see it, particularly seniors who recognized the weight of small, decisive moments, the moments that quietly defined lives. Thomas often walked through Main Street during his lunch breaks, keeping Rex by his side. They passed the same stretch of curb where Harold had collapsed. Snow had softened the edges of the pavement, but Thomas could still imagine the scene, the sudden falter, the panic in the crowd, the dog surging forward as though time itself had slowed. Children waved when they saw Rex, remembering stories from school. Adults nodded, some whispering thanks, others pausing to smile at the pair. There was reverence in their gaze, a recognition of courage without spectacle. For Thomas, the incident had left a permanent imprint. He reflected on every decision, every instinct, and realized the truth of a quiet principle he had long suspected, but never fully embraced. Courage doesn't always follow rules. Loyalty isn't always obedience. And sometimes life hangs on the choices made in fractions of a second, often by those who cannot speak, but understand more than we ever could. Harold, now safely at home, began slowly returning to his routines. He walked carefully through his snow-covered yard, leaning on his cane but steady. Rex accompanied him faithfully, keeping pace, scanning the environment, alert to every movement. The veteran would pause occasionally, looking down at the dog with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. "You're more than a dog, Rex," Harold murmured once, watching the snowflakes gather on the German shepherd's fur. "You're a guardian." Thomas observed these walks from the station occasionally, feeling a sense of completion yet knowing the story's impact stretched far beyond that quiet moment in the snow. He documented the incident in the unit's logs, detailing Rex's actions with precision and admiration, understanding that someday other canine handlers might read it and recognize the profound responsibility and the rare courage of a dog capable of saving a life. Months passed, snow melted, and the town slowly moved into spring. But the memory of that winter morning remained vivid. Thomas and Rex continued their patrols, attending community events, visiting schools, and reminding the town of quiet heroism. Harold recovered steadily, and though he never returned to the parade that year, he made sure to write letters of thanks to Thomas and Rex, emphasizing the emotional weight of those moments that had saved him. In Brookdale, the story endured not because of spectacle, but because it reminded everyone of something essential. The extraordinary often hides within the ordinary, waiting for the right moment to act. A dog trained for obedience had broken formation. A human, disciplined in procedure, had trusted instinct. And together they had saved a life. The following Veterans Day, the town dedicated a small plaque near the parade route, featuring a silhouette of a German shepherd in motion. Words etched beneath read, "Courage and loyalty are sometimes found in the quietest of heroes." Thomas stood with Rex at the dedication. Older veterans saluting, children wide-eyed, families whispering reverence. Snow, soft and persistent, began to fall again, echoing the winter of that fateful day. A reminder that some stories, like snowflakes, settle quietly yet leave lasting impressions. Thomas reached down, hand resting on Rex's strong shoulder. "You did good," he whispered. "Better than I ever could have asked." Rex tilted his head and barked softly, as if agreeing, as if to say the work wasn't about recognition, it was about trust, action, and instinct. Brookdale would remember that winter, not for the parade, not for the drums or flags, but for the quiet courage of a dog who broke formation, ran into the unknown, and ensured that a life, fragile and precious, would continue. And in that memory, Thomas and Rex found something more profound than ceremony, medals or headlines. They found the simple, enduring truth. Heroism sometimes wears fur and walks on four legs. As Thomas and Rex walked home through the softly falling snow that evening, footprints trailing behind them like echoes of bravery, the town remained hushed. Snow covered everything evenly, but not entirely. Under the surface lay proof of instinct, loyalty, and courage, the invisible threads binding human and animal, veteran and officer, life and survival. And somewhere in the quiet of the snowfall, the world seemed a little safer, a little warmer, because one dog had chosen to act when the rest of the world hesitated. Thomas paused at the corner of Main Street, watching snow drift past the lamppost where Harold had fallen. He smiled faintly. The world was full of rules, regulations, and order, but sometimes the right choice was made in silence without applause, by someone or something willing to trust their heart. Rex sat beside him, ears flicking against the wind. The dog's eyes, deep and knowing, met Thomas's. No words were exchanged. None were needed. And in that quiet, snowy street of Brookdale, courage, loyalty, and life continued. Unseen by most, but deeply felt by all who knew the story.